The world champion Magnus Carlsen is in action again, and I'm going to take you through his first round game from the Grenke Chess Classic. And this is a fantastic tournament. Carlsen is playing, but he is facing Fabiano Caruana again, and also there's Levon Aronian, Maxime Vachier-Lagrave, Arkady Naidic. This is a great event. But in the first round, Magnus Carlsen had a very difficult opponent. He was facing the 14-year-old Vincent Keymer from Germany. Now, Keymer is an enormous talent. He's here in this tournament on merit because he won the Grenke Open last year. So he's rated way below the other players. Nevertheless, an incredible talent. So difficult round for both players, obviously for Keymer facing the world champion, but for Carlsen as well. All the pressure was on Carlsen here in this first round game. So d4. Now, what would Carlsen do? Would he play, something solid like with e6 and d5 as he normally does? No. He's going for an Indian defense, a kind of Benoni King's Indian. This can transpose into Benoni or a straight King's Indian, or it could be, well, something a little bit different again. So let's see where we've got to with this. So Carlsen has done this kind of thing before. For example, in a speed match against Ding. Ding liked to go knight e2 to g3. Bishop d3 is also a normal move. Keymer started thinking for a long time in this pretty standard opening position, actually, but obviously, he was a little bit thrown out of his, thrown off balance. Probably didn't expect this one. And here, well, one could play e6 and go into a kind of Benoni, but Carlsen played e5 very quickly. So now we're back in a King's Indian type position, except Carlsen has thrown this pawn forward to c5, which, well, there are pros and cons to this move, obviously. Means, obviously, it blocks white from advancing with c5. But then again, it's possible for white to break open the position quite quickly with b4. But I think the point is, Carlsen gets what he wants, which is a position which is a little bit different and still very tense indeed. Petrosian used to play in this way, actually, in his early days before he went very solid. Knight e8. Well, this prepares, of course, the standard advance with the f-pawn. So now we've got knight e1. And, well, instead of allowing a position like knight d3 and f4, which is possible, white can play like this, Keymer plays, I think, in a more, well, I was going to say safety first way. I wouldn't say this is a safe position for either side, but there isn't quite as much at stake when you allow your opponent to push forward with f4, because white is able to block the f-pawn in this case. So we just have a very tense situation. And, well, this is a very old position, actually. This has been seen in several games in the 1960s. So there is nothing new under the sun. Knight d3 played. That's, white certainly doesn't have to play knight d3. You can play bishop e3 and simply block there. But Keymer wanted to tempt this pawn forward and then put his knight on f2 to cover the g4 square. So now that the structure is fixed, that makes it much easier for, well, both sides in a way, but certainly easier for white to determine where he wants his pieces. And now Carlsen very quickly makes a massive decision. I think this is the world champion's great strength. He is so decisive in his games, and that puts all the pressure on your opponent. What he did was he exchanged on c3. Now, shock, horror, giving up this beautiful dark squared bishop, which was raking across the board. Point is, that white squared bishop can't get onto the long diagonal because of that pawn on c3 and the pawn on c5 preventing the bishop coming to d4. So now we've got a structure which is more akin to a Nimzo-Indian, actually, where the bishop would come out to b4 and then take on c3. There are precedents to this particular capture, and in fact Petrosian was one of the first to do this. So I'm going to digress for a moment here. I'm going to take you to the game Bronstein against Petrosian, Amsterdam 1964. Very famous precedent for this capture. There we go. We can see really similar structure, also from a King's Indian, and in this position. Sorry, Bronstein Petrosian 1956, I should say, Amsterdam 56. I beg your pardon, not 64. Petrosian took on c3, and this at that time was an absolutely shocking move. But Petrosian understood that this bishop finds it very difficult to get into the game, and well, Petrosian managed to build up on the king side. The players eventually agreed to a draw in a very tense position, actually, but you can see how black is building up here. I'm just going to go through to the final position, actually, because it does have some relevance to what happens in our game. And here the players agreed to a draw. I guess they just felt it was, well, it's very difficult for either side to break through in this position. But that is the key feature. This dark squared bishop cannot get into the game. Okay, now bear that in mind. Let's come back to this position. So here is where Carlsen took on c3. Very, very similar. He knows the classics. Carlsen knew exactly what he's doing. But the pieces are arranged a little bit differently. You can see there's no knight on c7. Black's knights have come to the king side very quickly. But still, this exchange on c3 is a very contentious exchange. And it's possible here for Keymer to play very much as Bronstein did with h3 and maybe put the king here and shuffle the rook over. That's possible. And then it's not so easy for Carlsen to break through. But black can actually try to break through on the queen side later on with this kind of idea. So it's not a completely dead position. But Keymer played knight d1, and I think his idea was probably to give room for the queen to reach the king side. Possibly also bishop coming over to h4 is a possibility as well. And now bishop a4 from Carlsen. So, well, as we're going to see, he has in mind this exchange. It's possible for this knight to push the bishop away, but I suspect that Carlsen would play it back to e8 and then bounce round to h5 to exchange off one of those bishops and maybe weaken the support for that pawn. In any case, after bishop a4, h3 played by Keymer, and bishop takes knight. So Carlsen gets rid of that knight, which was perhaps looking to bounce into e3, which would be a good situation, good position for it. So I can understand why Carlsen went for that. But this position isn't necessarily very promising for black, but Carlsen has what he wants, which is imbalance. And here, well, with the king stepping out to f2 after g4, then you have to be careful of a move like queen h6. So Keymer waits for the moment. a4, reasonable move, starts to cramp black on the king side, on the queen side, I beg your pardon. Rook g8 played by Carlsen. Queen f1. And now I think if Carlsen wanted to play, reasonably solidly, he could advance his h-pawn here, like this. Put the pawn on h4, and after this, well, I think if he wants to draw, he could play queen g3 here, and I think this would basically just close the position up, and I think this will be a draw. But instead, Carlsen played a very provocative move. He played knight to h5. So for the moment, g4 isn't possible because this would open up the f file, and that would be disastrous for the king. So for the moment, Keymer just has to hold fire with g3. So again, this is about preventing g4, but that knight is very oddly placed on h5. So long as Keymer avoids the tactics here on the king's side, in fact, it's very hard for black to do anything here. Queen g2 and now queen f6 hits the pawn, defends the pawn, and now, well, this shows Carlsen's ambition. He could have forced a draw here with knight takes pawn. Now, let's just check out the tactics. After queen takes, knight h5, that's a nice move. So if the queen comes back, then queen h4 is very strong. So bishop takes knight, rook takes queen. Now, this looks disastrous for black. Rook and two bishops against a queen, but in fact, after this move, bishop has to come back, rook g8, and actually in this position, well, black can just close it because the king can't step out of this pin. King here, rook takes rook, obviously king g2, you can take the rook again. So this is basically just a positional draw. White can do absolutely nothing in this position, but black also can't improve the position. So both sides would just shuffle back and forth and it's a draw. But Carlsen wanted more, and by this stage, Keymer was running low on the clock. So typical Carlsen game, he's playing quickly, Keymer was taking his time, and yeah, Vincent took quite a lot of time in the opening. But he's playing well. The g4 advance has come. And white is now in the driving seat. There's no doubt about it. Carlsen looking for counterplay on the queen side. And here is where Keymer makes a lunge, but it's incorrect. He makes a mistake. If he'd simply continued rolling up on the king side with h4 and so on, then these knights look absolutely dreadful. There's a lot of nonsense talked about knights in closed positions. In this particular closed position, they don't have really good posts to go to. And after that h-pawn advances and maybe the bishop follows up on h5, white has a tremendous position. But instead, Keymer went for g6. h6, and now he must have simply overlooked that in this position queen d8 prevents the queen coming to h4, hoping to give checkmate on h6. So Keymer played instead rook b1, and then, well, queen g3, same thing, queen d8 prevents the queen coming here. Here I didn't quite understand why Keymer didn't just play in this position, actually, after knight e8, why he didn't just play h4 and h5 to support this g-pawn. He must have been worried about something. Maybe he just thought the knights would come over to hit this pawn, but it seems to me white is okay there. But he played king d2, and suddenly that pawn is in big trouble. it's not going to be possible to hold on to it with bishop h5. That bishop will be hit, and well, black is going to, for example, move the rook across, and that g pawn is going to drop. So that pawn is now lost, and suddenly the game has turned completely. Now watch out for tricky e3 checks as well. So Keymer blocks the pawn, but that pawn on g6 is dropping, and suddenly Carlsen is a pawn up and looking very good here. Still haven't reached the time control, so Keymer short of time still, but over these last few moves he gives himself the best chance. Puts the pawn on h5, and that allows the bishop to come to h4. So he has finally improved the position of that bishop. And this is still not a simple position for Carlsen to win. Over the next few moves, I should say that they've reached time control at move 40. So they get, I think it's 50 minutes added to the clock, plus they get 30 seconds per move. And Carlsen just kind of shuffled around here, feinting at things like, this sacrifice, and maybe knight g4, maybe taking on h5, maybe looking at a breakthrough here. Keymer wasn't sure exactly what Magnus was up to. So while Magnus was still moving pretty quickly, Keymer was taking his time, and his time was running down, and they had to get to move 60. That's the next time control. So this is the big dilemma when you're facing a player as strong as Magnus. How much do you believe him? When is that critical moment going to come? Should you be moving very quickly as well? It's a really tough one, and already, well, things are starting to happen. So Magnus has done a bit of a shuffle. That rook is going to come over here. Maybe it'll be possible to bring that knight in to g4, and the h-pawn looks vulnerable. So Keymer decided, time to break. a5. Well, again, a contentious decision, but actually I think absolutely the right decision, because it's very important for him to create counterplay and put some doubt in Carlsen's mind, actually, that white does have counterplay on the other side of the board. Of course, this also gives black possibilities here as well, because now that knight can switch round potentially to b6, and the a-pawn has some potential too. So queen f8, knight b6, and here Carlsen thought for 3 minutes, got 4 moves to make until the time control. And here, I was watching this game live and checking out the Norwegian supercomputer Sessa.net if you're interested. When you're watching Carlsen at a tournament, always interesting to check out Sessa.net. And there it was very keen on playing a5. But this is a very loose move to play, because the knight's support would go. And, well, for example, this rook would be able to station itself on b5. Now, this is a very tricky position, and the supercomputer likes this, but I'm telling you, in practical terms, this is not an easy position to play for black at all. And looking down the computer's main line, there were like a series of absolutely only moves that black had to find, some really bizarre moves as well. So Carlsen, he played a practical move. He played rook g7. Now the computer does not like this move at all. It basically thinks that white is now drawing the game. And let's see what happened. So this bishop comes round to attack the f pawn from h3. King comes over to stop the pawn. And now knight a4. So Carlsen had got this far in his calculations. They'd reached the time control at move 60, so that meant that 15 minutes was added to the clock for both players. Carlsen had ages, absolutely ages of time. Keymer was basically down to 15 minutes after move 60. And this is still not an easy position to calculate. So white to move. If king takes knight, then this pawn is going to go home. And if king takes pawn, well, we get something similar in the game. So bishop h3, and now an excellent move from Carlsen, queen g7. Best chance. Now this forces an exchange of queens, because obviously queen takes pawn check, and that will lead to mate very soon, if white's queen moves away. So exchange of queens. Bishop takes f5. This is forced situation. Keymer at this point was under 4 minutes. 4 minutes for the rest of the game. 30 seconds is added per move. Nevertheless, very difficult to calculate, these long variations when you're so short of time. Well, he gets the first move right. King takes pawn, and now knight takes pawn. So tricky when this king seems to be a long way from the action. This knight is buzzing round into the position, and potentially this e-pawn is going to fly, and the h-pawn is vulnerable. So all the pressure is on Keymer still in this position. Very clever of Magnus to head for this position. He knows how to maintain the pressure. But here Keymer blunders under pressure. He could have played king b3. Let's have a look at this variation. And let's see what happens. This looks absolutely desperate for white, because this pawn is going to drop after king g5. It seems absolutely hopeless for white. But in fact, white's king has time to come round to attack the d6 pawn, and then that d pawn is close enough to the queenie square. Let's just have a very quick look. Here, and well, I'm sure you can do the counting, but basically they're going to queen at the same time, and white is more than fine. So coming back to this position, king b3 would have drawn the game, but Keymer, I think understandably, who knows? He's under pressure. He's got very little time. He couldn't calculate it out. And bishop f2 played. The thing is, optically, you just abandon that variation because it looks like black is just breaking through. But in fact, the king had time to get around. And now Carlsen is in control. Those knights are able to take the pawns. And crucially, in this position, after white's king comes round, black's king runs over to protect the d6 pawn, and Carlsen has things under control. If bishop h4, then simply e3, and that's too strong. White doesn't have time to take here because the bishop is on, and black is too fast. So in this position, bishop e3, knight d4, h5, and the second pawn comes into play. Knight f3, good move, preparing the advance. Knight d2. Carlsen still had to be precise here actually, but he gets it absolutely spot on. So he's looking at this one, and if white does nothing, then just knight takes pawn. Keymer tries this, but now the e-pawn is free again. Knight f3 attacks the bishop. Well, Keymer took on f6 here. Obviously, if the bishop comes back, then h4 is the end. So he took. And now, well, Carlsen just had to calculate this out. He did that before offering this exchange, of course. And watch the d-pawn. Be careful of this, but you can. You play knight d4. And here, yeah, the point is that when the pawn advances, you've got knight e6. And one of black's pawns is going through. This was the end of the story. So e2, final move of the game. Keymer resigned here. He was down to nothing. Let's just see how it could go. Yeah, the point is if d6, then you can come here and the knight is back in time to stop that one, and this one goes through. So absolutely the right moment to resign in that position after e2. Well, that game lasted the best part of 7 hours. They were certainly well in over 6.5 hours. Really tough game, but once again Carlsen proved the kind of stamina he has and how good at practical decisions he is. He couldn't be sure of finding a win even after he'd won that pawn, but found a way with that move. Well, queen g7, and before then rook g7 to create complications, and it was just too much for Keymer in the end. Well, it's going to be very interesting to see how Keymer reacts to that. I hope that he does okay in this tournament. It's tough. He's only 14, but he had a real lesson today. All the other games were drawn, so Carlsen takes an early lead in the Grenke Chess Classic.